you know. The story of the Lake Nyos disaster. The lake periodically belches a cloud of invisible carbon dioxide gas that suffocates everything within a 16-mile radius. In 1986, over 1,700 people and all their livestock died without even understanding what was happening to them. I could not speak. I became unconscious. I could not open my mouth because then I smelled something terrible. I heard my daughter snoring in a terrible way, very abnormal. When crossing to my daughter's bed, I collapsed and fell. I was there till 9 o'clock in the morning of Friday, the next day, until a friend of mine came and knocked at my door. I was surprised to see that my trousers were red, had some stains like honey. I saw some starchy mess on my body. My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got these wounds. I opened the door. I wanted to speak, my breath would not come out. My daughter was already dead. I went into my daughter's bed, thinking that she was still sleeping. I slept till it was 4:30 in the afternoon. On Friday, the same day. Then, I managed to go over to my neighbors' houses. They were all dead. I decided to leave. Because, most of my family was in Wom. I got my motorcycle. A friend whose father had died left with me, for Wom. As I rode through Nyos, I didn't see any sign of any. Got to Wom, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak. The Nutty Putty Cave Incident. A spelunker got stuck upside down in a narrow cave for 26 hours. Crews tried to pull him out with pulleys, but had to be careful not to break his legs, because that could be fatal with the circumstances he was in. Rescuers even almost dislodged him, only for an anchor to fail at the last second, plunging him back into the crevice. He eventually died, and they sealed the cave shut with him inside. I read about this a few weeks ago. I had heart palpitations just thinking about being stuck in that hole. Just scary as hell. Thinking about it now makes my hands sweaty. In the 80s there was a Mexican cult led by an American named Adolfo Constanzo. They used to kidnap random people from tourist towns and nearby cities and perform human sacrifice on them in their rural Mexican desert compound, usually torturing in elaborate rituals for hours or days before finally letting them die. These rituals included vivisections, castrations, eyeball removal, tongue removal, teeth pulling, skin flaying, hanging, etc. They used amphetamines and cocaine to force the victim to stay awake during the torture and not pass out from shock. The cult believed the more pain and fear they could generate in the sacrifice victim, the more powerful the body parts would be as ritual trinkets and also for food for the cult's nganga, which is a large ritual cauldron used to store bones, blood, meat, and other valuable items that the cult believed gave them power. They used to make staves out of wired together spinal columns, and they would often eat the victim's eyeballs during the rituals. They are believed to have kidnapped and sacrificed over 26 people to their nganga in their 3 years that they were active from 1986 to 1989. The leader committed suicide when the police showed up at their compound. They arrested 14 cult members, but most people believe there were at least a dozen more that escaped and are still out there. I've told this story before. I'm an eye doctor and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down, you know that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids? It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anyhow, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess, it was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had a bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva and within 2 days the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case for those interested. TLDR, Patient had a bug lay an egg in her eyelid and I removed the larva. A guy in a sinking ship found an oxygen bubble and only drank a sip of Diet Coke every 7 hours. He was rescued after 60 hours after being under constant danger from drowning and even sharks. Sharks are notoriously fans of Pepsi. The story of Jamie Kloss is terrifying. In rural Wisconsin last year, a 13-14-ish-year-old girl went missing after her parents were murdered in their home. Police arrived within 4 minutes or so, but she is just gone. Of course, speculation is that she was kidnapped, or that she was in on it, or dead, or whatever. Nobody knows because she has completely vanished. 88 days later, in the dead of a northern Wisconsin winter, she runs out into the street to a woman walking her dog. She had been held captive about 40 minutes from her home. All of that is scary enough, but here's the terrifying part. She had never had any contact with the guy that murdered her family and abducted her. One day he was driving to a new job, at which he only lasted a day, and saw her get on the school bus. At that moment he decided that he was going to take her. There was no warning. No grooming. There was absolutely nothing that she or her family could have done to avoid everything. A creepy young man saw her from 100 away and decided that he would murder her family and take her for himself. I remember reading ages ago about a guy who was in the military. He got back home after a tour of duty to find his wife and 2 kids dead. They lived in a remote location. Turned out the mom had a sudden heart attack or stroke or something and the 2 little kids had died of starvation or dehydration as they were too young to care for themselves. Not exactly a ghost story, but as a parent that scares the shit out of me. Reminds me of a story. Dad, Mom and 3 kids decide they want to spend a weekend away at their cabin, but Dad has to work on Friday. They decide Mom and kids will go on ahead without him and he will meet them at the cabin Saturday morning. Gigantic storm rolls through and suddenly a fucking tornado touches down. It destroys part of town, including the neighborhood where the family lives. Dad is a firefighter so they are swamped with rescues but Dad is happy his family is safe at the cabin. His truck finish their active calls and decide to take a drive around town to look for anyone needed help and see all the damage and they drive down the family's street. The house is half destroyed but more importantly, Dad spots Mom's car in the driveway. Mom and all 3 kids died because they had decided to wait for Dad as a surprise. There was over 25 deaths in total from the tornado. Dad ended up committing suicide a year or so later. The story was told to my dad when he went through first responder counseling by the firefighter Dad's old co-worker. The murder of the Green family. A deranged pedo named Joseph Edward Duncan was already on the run from the cops for a past sexual assault. He was incredibly charming and manipulative, and was truly pure evil. He camped outside a family's rural home, unseen by them. He picked it out after driving past it and seeing children's toys outside. He watched them from afar, got to know their routine with the intent of kidnapping the children, 10-year-old Dylan, 8-year-old Shasta. Jed found the lock on the door was broken, entered the home in the middle of the night and tied up the mom, dad and teenage son. He put Shasta and Dylan in his car and killed the rest of the family with a hammer. He traveled around various campsites and cabins with Shasta and Dylan captive, sexually abusing, torturing and raping them. He eventually shot Dylan but Shasta talked him out of killing her. Jed ended up telling her she taught him how to love. The scariest part is the CCTV footage of Jed and Shasta at a gas station. Because you could easily believe they were just a normal dad and a grumpy daughter if you were an onlooker. Eventually, he took her to a diner where he was finally apprehended when a waitress noticed something was up and Shasta was saved after 7 weeks in his clutches. As he was dragged away, he called to her, "Promise me you'll visit me in prison," and she said she would. I don't know if she ever did. Jed was put on death row and found to be guilty of 3 previous child murders. He died a few months ago from cancer. But the worst part of it all is how horrible Shasta's life has been afterwards. Drug addiction, in and out of jail, losing her children, etc. Just the most horrifying story ever. Allison Boda. On December 18, 1994, Port Elizabeth resident Alison Bota was abducted, raped, stabbed and left for dead by Franz du Toit and Thunz Kruger. They slashed her throat 17 times, so deep she had to hold her own head on as she crawled to the road for help. With her other hand she had to hold in the organs spilling from her stomach, where she had been stabbed more than 30 times. By some miracle the knife thrusts had missed her main arteries, so she did not bleed to death and was able to breathe through her severed trachea. There is a documentary that is on Amazon Prime called, Alison. Worth the watch but might be traumatic for some viewers. Trailer for Alison. In 1949, Timothy Evans was wrongly executed for murdering his pregnant wife and daughter. The actual murderer, John Christie, was a prosecution witness at Evans' trial. After Evans was executed, Christie went on to kill 4 more people. Had the police handled the forensic evidence properly, Christie would have been caught when they were investigating Evans, and those 4 people would still be alive. The government didn't acknowledge that Evans was innocent until 2004. The Raina Marroquin story. A young lady had an affair with her boss in the 1960s, got pregnant. After threatening to tell her boss wife, she was killed by her boss, who then put her body in an industrial barrel. He hid the barrel in his house for years and none of the various owners opened it due to the weight. Finally one guy decided to dispose of it in the 90s, and when he opened it he saw it contained something. An investigation traced the barrel and girl back to the man, who then killed himself before police could come arrest him after confirming he was the father of the unborn baby via DNA. The lady's mother was in her late 80s when she was told her missing daughter was finally found. She claims that she had been having dreams about her daughter being inside a metal container for years after she had gone missing. I don't know if it's scary, but when I was younger me and my twin brother would help our friend do his paper route. One summer we could smell something gross coming from one of the houses. We all didn't think anything of it until 3 days later when the smell was reaching down the driveway. We went to the back door where he normally dropped the paper and noticed it was open. We went in and looked around the house and found the owner dead. He had died of a heart attack and his cats were eating him. Joseph Fritzl imprisoned his daughter in a secret room in his basement for 24 years, and fathered 6-7 children on her. He actually fucking planned the whole thing 6 years in advance, got a building permit and built a inescapable apartment-like prison underneath his house. He drove miles to dispose of trash and do shopping for the imprisoned and not be recognized while doing so. Seriously fucked up. He was only found out because one of the children he fathered got seriously ill and had to be taken to the hospital after spending her whole 19-year-long life underground. He claimed that his daughter, Elizabeth, thought to have been abducted by a cult, dropped the granddaughter off at his house because she wasn't able to take care of the sick young woman. Doctors found the story fishy, involved authorities and demanded to speak to Elizabeth in order to find out what her daughter was suffering from. I'm on my phone so please forgive my formatting. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them, as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of for years meant the entire crews of both ships was slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia and general mental deterioration, combined with already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2-3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost in Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains discovered by local Inuits, Netsilik tribes, who described desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents and even human body parts in cookpots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. My maternal grandfather, in the days before hot water on tap, put a big pot on to boil before leaving for work for his wife and kids to bathe with. The pot boiled over and extinguished the flame, and he returned to find them dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. My mother was of his second marriage. I'm not sure what the entire story is, but there was a body discovered somewhere in Siberia. His cause of death was freezing, but something was off. Turns out, he had been attacked by a tiger. The tiger used his jaws and grabbed the guy by his backpack, picked him up over his head, and slammed him so hard that it snapped both of his femurs. Poor dude lived 3 days after the attack, crawling around in the snow. The USS West Virginia was a ship damaged during the attack on Pearl Harbor. After the ship was attacked, the people on board heard banging noises coming from inside the ship. Turns out that these noises were people. They were trapped in a room to where they couldn't be broken out of it because of the water that would seep in and drown them, and they couldn't be brought out from the top because of the gases that lingered there that were extremely flammable. When the vessel was salvaged 6 months later, the bodies of these 3 men were found. The other things that remained were empty cans of food and water and a calendar marked from December 7th to December 23rd. This means they were trapped in there for 16 days. They probably kept wondering if they were ever going to make it out, and then had to come to the realization that they might not be saved, and they had the fear of drowning in the tight little compartment of the ship. They had to face the realization that you are going to die and the psychological torture that goes along with it. Happened to my boss's best friend when they were around 17. Best friend's parents were out of town one weekend and she had the house to herself. Went about her business, having dinner, watching TV, then decided to go to bed. She was lying in her bed with her back to her closet when she heard the door open. She somehow pretended to be asleep. The man who was hiding in the closet walked around her bed to the side she was laying, facing, gently stroked her hair and face, then left. She immediately called her boyfriend to ask him to come over, then called her parents and then the police. Long story short, this man had been getting into their home via a doggy door. They didn't have a dog and didn't bother to secure it, and he'd been living in a tent in the foresty area behind their home for months to creep on her. They found a ton of surveillance footage of her sleeping and pieces of her clothes and stuff. If I recall correctly, this happened somewhere in Alabama, most likely mid-2000s. The Silent Gibbon twins. 2 sisters who rarely spoke except to each other. They were sent to separate boarding schools to get them to talk to other people, but entered severe catatonia. They were eventually hospitalized and made a pact that if one of them died, the other must speak and live a normal life. They had a months-long discussion and decided which one should commit suicide. Eventually, one died of heart inflammation, no causes noted on the autopsy. And just moments after the planned time, the other spoke. "I'm free at last, liberated, and at last Jennifer has given up her life for me." The Broken Arrow killings. 2 brothers brutally murdered their entire family. At one point their young, 5 or 6-ish, Siblings were hiding in the bathroom when one of the brothers pretended to need their help. Soon as they let him in, he killed them. One of their last words were, "Please don't kill me, I love you." Horrifying story. There was a guy in my town who stalked women at the furniture store. He would watch women pick out new chairs and he would just linger there and drop these strange comments: "That chair would look nice in my den." Then one night he followed one of the women home. He sneaked into their living room and then wait for them to enter the room. He'd then jump out and surprise them. He'd yell, "I knew you took my chair." And he'd scream and chase them. This happened over the course of 5 years. The local police never did anything because he was brothers with the sheriff. Women couldn't buy furniture by themselves. They had to start bringing chaperones. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. A guy I was good friends with had a party one night and called me to invite me over. It was me and my wife's first day off together in a while and our daughter was 2 years old. I mentioned it to my wife and my daughter said, "Nah, don't go daddy." Of course I can't resist that, so I stayed home and we had a good night. My friend, however, had the life. His party was going good and everything was fine, even though there was a friend of a friend there who no one really knew. Turns out the stranger had been smoking PCP and decided to start killing people. He took a butcher knife and slashed 3 people's throats. My friend's wife threw their kids out of a 2-story window and jumped out herself, took them into the woods and called the police. All 3 people died. The police found the guy walking down the side of the road covered in blood and incoherent. He had no idea what he just did. So he said, "What really pisses me off is he was such a good guy. He was a big biker-looking teddy bear. Was never an asshole to anyone and always did what was the right thing. We worked together and hit it off from day one. Always ready with a joke and smile. Maybe not going saved my life, or maybe I could have helped. That weighs on me even 20 years later. The fact that some little pos destroyed the lives of 3 good families that he didn't even know really pisses me off and I hope he rots in prison and gets his ass kicked every day. Rip Blaine. You were a good man.